This is Yasin from Finland. I'm really excited to be here today. It's my first time hosting actually, so bear with me with the technicalities. I hope everything goes smoothly, and I should be able to see your comments on LinkedIn here in this stream. So let me know if something seems off, if the voice is not clear, if the presentation is not clear, and yeah, I'm curious if anyone even sees it. And yes, I got a comment, so it means it's working. And yeah, welcome. Maybe let's start. So yes, I'm Yasin Atibolu. I work at Supercell. I'm actually currently on a paternal leave for our baby. And while now that I have a bit time off, well, not really time off, but I had some time to put together some slides. And I want to talk to you today about data science and level design. Oh, perfect. Sound is good, video is clear. Thanks, Dominic. Yeah, and I thought in the last 2 years, I have been posting a lot of content about, well, not a lot of, but every now and then I've been posting some content about data science and sometimes data science and level design. How do we make better levels in match games, especially? It's an area that I worked maybe around 5-6 years, and I mostly have been in level design teams as a data analyst. So it's an area that I really loved, and I also have been a product manager in match games. So I thought I could host this session where we could gather, and then I can tell you about my experiences. Yeah, very shortly about me. I'm from Turkey, born and raised in Turkey. I studied in Austria, and I have been living in Finland since 2017. I have a bachelor's degree in econometrics. Econometrics is basically economics meets statistics, and master degree in quantitative finance. And I have been in the gaming industry for almost 8 years now. I started in Austria, and then I was at Seriously in Finland. Then after the closure, I moved to Rovio as a product manager, and then I have been at Supercell now for a year almost. And today I want to talk about we have witnessed the growth of match games in the last maybe at least a decade now. And when people were saying, okay, no one can beat Candy Crush or I don't know, Toon Blast, then there was the Royal Match, and people were surprised, like, hey, like maybe there's hope, maybe there's something new still unexplored, and that made me even more excited about what we can learn all together. So here I'm trying to share my experiences, and maybe I can bring something new to the table from my own analysis and observations. And before I start, yes, there will be a recording. So let's talk about how to make better puzzle levels. And by that, it's a bit vague question. So a better level is not a binary thing, right? So it's about how players feel, which is determining the engagement. But then there's also business perspective, right? So we want our levels to be difficult enough to challenge the players, and maybe a fraction of those players will eventually need to pay. That's where the monetization part comes in. So it is very important in, just like in any games, also in match games, it's very important that there's a good balance between engagement and monetization, and that is determined mostly by, of course, how the game feels, but also by difficulty of the levels. So to reply to the question, how can we make better puzzle levels to support the business? I like to divide it into 5 parts. So how can we identify good levels, first of all? because to claim what makes a good level, we need to have tools to say, okay, this is a good and this is a bad level. So to me, that's the $1,000,000 question. And now, what kind of level design guidelines should we follow, or what kind of mechanics should we have in the levels? And then, how do we design the level objectives? Because it turns out that they are very hardly tied to the experience and the performance of the levels. And of course, our biggest adjustment tool, the balancing tool here, is the difficulty. So how difficult should the levels be? And also turns out that the length of the levels even have a role here. So I also want to talk about that from my experience. But let's talk about how can we make better puzzle levels. So from the user perspective, a fun level is not necessarily where players pass on the first attempts, right? Like you would get bored if you pass 100 levels consecutively on the first attempt and you still have 10 moves left when you finish the level. That would be boring. Or if you go to the other side, if you want to challenge players, it's also not fun to get stuck 100 attempts, 200 attempts, which is very usual in games. Sometimes some players may get stuck for even 1,000 attempts, but none is optimal here. So that's why we have the cadencing of difficulty. Like I'm sure you may have heard that we don't necessarily have super easy levels all the time, but it's each cadence has first easy and then a bit difficult and a bit more difficult level. So we want to optimize definitely for that. And from the business perspective, we want a core content, aka levels, that generate high resource sync. And because of that, it will lead to in-app purchases. But then we want to also minimize the churn. Again, back to the question, what makes a level good? So it's a bit still ambiguous question. So we ask a follow-up question. How does one even identify? That's a good point. Yeah, I thought I was sharing. That's because I am. Yeah, thanks, Mazi. I will. Yes. Let me share my screen. Can you see now? It should. Yeah. Yes, it should be visible now. All right. So how can we make? Yep. Thank you. How can we make better levels? So that's what I talked about. How do we identify good levels and mechanics and the level objectives and the difficulty and the length of the levels? That's what matters. So yes, this is the key question. What makes a level good? I will first start with how to identify even what makes a level good. And then how does one even identify what makes a good level a good level? Because you can say, okay, level 100 seems to be better than level 98, but then how do we know what makes level 100 better than 98? And indeed, there's a bit of delay, so please excuse any awkwardness. Let's start. So now it's a bit data science part. We will talk about how can we identify good levels. So we want to identify levels that are performing better, and we would like to make more of them, right? Or if you find levels that are not very good, like they are poorly performing, then we want to make less of them. And of course, we would like to understand what makes them suboptimal or bad. So we would avoid those mechanics. So the next question is, how does one even identify a good level? So before getting there, I want to talk about what metrics matter here. So of course, extra moves usage. That's where most of the money comes from, right? Players in difficult levels run out of moves, and then they are asked, "Hey, do you want to purchase X extra moves?" And by paying some coins, and it's tied to the difficulty, of course. How many attempts does it take to win a level, or what percentage of players see the out of move screen? So these are important metrics here. And of course, churn. What is the proportion of players who start a certain level and then become inactive? I think that's a good way to define churn and attribute it to kind of blame a level for churn. So if we look at now, here's the data science part of it. So here we have a scatter plot where on the x-axis we have the fail count, and on the y-axis we have the coin sync per active player per level. So now I have a level of, like, this is simulated data. So I tried to make an example of how to visualize this. So here what we see is, for example, level 4004, 4010, and 4000. These have the same difficulty, right? So players, this means players in these levels, it took them 3 failures before winning the level. So we can say that they are somewhat equally difficult. But then we see that their coin sync, resource sync, is not the same, which is interesting. So we could say that ceteris paribus, like assuming everything is the same, and here we are controlling for fail count, level 4004 is syncing like 3 times more than level 4000. So it seems like something is working really well there. And to generalize this method, what we could do is, for a given level range, here we have levels from 4000 to 4020. If we draw an average expected coin sync curve given the fail count, so we can say, okay, if we have a level of difficulty of 4, then we expect 20 coin sync. That's great. But if a level is above this line, then that means this level is overperforming. And if it's below, then it's underperforming. In other words, if the levels outperform their neighboring levels in terms of difficulty, and also neighboring levels in terms of how close they are in the saga, then they are good ones. And the same way, if it's lower than its peers, then that's not a good level. We can do the same. Now on the y-axis we have the churn rate. So that's the quit rate. Inactivity rate. And usually we define it as 3 to 7 days of inactivity, and then we blame the level for that. For example, level 4019, well, given the expected value, like we expect this much maybe churn, but it's higher. So we can say that it is churning more than expected. But then these levels, 4017 and 4009, they are churning less than their peers, so they are good ones. So now if we put all together, difficulty, sync, and churn, then we can say, well, there's this quadrant, like a matrix of performance measurement, right? There are levels that sync high and churn low, which I would call the best levels in our level content. And there are low sync levels and high churn levels. These are the worst levels then. I'm still curious if you can hear me, so I would like to see a comment when this reaches you, so thank you. Let's continue to possible action points. The reason why we want to identify those best and worst content is when we figure out the best levels, then we can look at those levels and the worst ones. We can go to our favorite level designer maybe, and then we can ask them, hey, like, do you see what makes these level, thank you, what makes these levels better than the worst ones, or why are the worst levels like bad? Then what we could do is, and it's something actually I have A/B tested in the past and worked quite well. You can then increase the difficulty of those levels that are performing well, because these levels already sync well given their difficulty, and they're able to tolerate the churn because they're fun levels maybe, and that will bring LTV growth. But then, because you also know that there are bad levels and they are churning more and not syncing much, then maybe it makes sense to tune down their difficulty, right? So because the difficulty will be low, then the churn will decrease. So what we are doing here is a really great balancing trick. In the end of the day, you can increase the sync and thus the monetization without increasing the churn, because you are not even increasing the difficulty. You are just shuffling the difficulty around based on how scalable levels are. And of course, we can also make a quadrant chart like this. So now we have those levels based on how far they are from their expected values. So here, these levels, for example, they are very far from these lines, right? Yes, there's actually a question about it. Does this apply? Good question. Does this apply to early levels like 1 to 20 or late game levels like 1000 plus? It works. I would say it works also in the early game, but in early game there are a lot of tutorial levels, and tutorial levels sometimes it's forced pass. Like you just can't fail. So if you can't fail, it's not very easy to measure the performance. But I would say when in non-tutorial levels, starting from maybe level 10, it should work. At least it worked for us. But it works even better later, like plus 1000, it will definitely work. Okay, let's continue. So in the middle, what this means is, for example, level 4007, 4020, and 4018. These levels are neutral, so they have exactly the expected amount of churn and coin sync, and they're fine. But then these are the ones that are perfect. But then on the other side here, these are the collection of levels that have low sync and high churn. So it's like the mirrored image. And these ones here, quadrant 1 and quadrant 3, there I would call, like, we call them the meh levels, because they are, yeah, they sync a lot but churn also high, or they sync not much but also doesn't churn much. And the action points here would be that definitely remove underperforming levels and replace them with the good ones that resemble the well-performing levels. And the further analysis here would be, or action point would be, now that we know how to attribute success to levels, let's try to correlate kind of like level components. For example, how many moves are there in a level? Are there slimes or jelly or multiple screens in a level, and how does it affect the performance? So we can basically do a statistical analysis there and figure out what makes a level good. Because if we know this, then we can make more of the good levels, which will bring high sync and low churn, and then we will avoid using the underperforming level mechanics, and then that will cause loss, because they are causing low sync and high churn, and that bleeds the lifetime value. Okay, and how do we know which mechanics should we have in the levels? Well, now that we know the quadrants, we can use a lot of different methods. We can do basically just taking averages, or we can go and use a linear regression, or we can use decision trees. And here I want to Okay, before we continue, there's one question I would like to answer that. Level sync or churn compared to what? To other levels from the same. Yes. Let's go back. So I will show a coin sync example. Here we have 20 levels from the same game. So these numbers are the level numbers. I'm sorry if I forgot to mention this, but these are the level numbers. And I'm comparing these levels coin sync per user and 4,000. I'm using these levels sync, difficult, and churn. And then I can compare, okay, given the same difficulty, because level 4004 and 4000, they have the same difficulty, but level 4004 syncs 3 times more. So yes, within the same game, I'm comparing these levels that have the same difficulty, but they have different monetary performance. So that's what I meant. And yes, so if you if you make good changes in a level, you can move from a bad quadrant to a good one. That's exactly the target here. But then if you change something that's bad in a level, a good in a level, and then you change it, you make it worse, it will move from quadrant 2 to 4, which is from best to worst. It's definitely possible. This is difficult. Can you rank all the levels, combine the churn and sync? One easy metric is sync divided by churn, but then these metrics are not necessarily linear over increasing difficulty. So we used that in the past, and in my at least, how to say it, like, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't just sync divided by churn. Because here, yeah, it's a linear line and maybe it works then, but it's not linear, then this single criteria won't work. Then another question, should we take into account sync of boosters? Yes, of course, for that you need to either make a different chart or convert the coin worth of boosters, worth of boosters into kind of a relevant metric like coin sync. So you have apple to apple, not apple and orange. So yes, what I'm showing here is a simplified version. It's just extra moves, but I think it's important to also take into account the pre-level boosters and also in-level boosters. But again, for the sake of simplicity, let's do on extra moves. And for the fact, most of, even if you have in-game boosters and pre-level boosters, most of the extra moves, most of the revenue indirectly comes from extra moves. Okay, let's continue. By the way, we will take questions after the session, so we can also continue that. Okay. So yes, we were saying here we can then use a decision tree to figure out what mechanics translate to what quadrant. Here's an example of what a decision tree is. So imagine that we have attributes like level reached in the first, let's say, 7 days and days since the installation. And of course, if a person reaches level 100 in the first day, it's different than a person who reached level only 7 in 2 months. So either the first person is very skilled or monetize a lot on the way. So this is a toy example. Numbers are definitely arbitrary here. So we can say that So the decision tree gives you these thresholds basically. It comes from the model. So when you put the data in, it says, okay, players who reach level 2.9 or less, they are non-spenders. And those who reach level 2.9 and above, then we are here. And if those players install the game, if they have been in the game only four days, then they are big spenders, which makes sense because if you relatively reach the higher level in a smaller time period, it probably means you are a big spender. And for those who installed later, and if they if they are still in the first 7 levels, then they are low spenders. Again, makes sense because they are still in the early game and they are slow. So yes, they are low spenders. And if they reach the higher level, then they are mid spenders. So this is again a toy example. What I'm trying to show here is for each split, we are actually controlling one variable, which is here, level reached. And now we are trying to find how can we predict, like in a non-linear way. The classes here, I'm trying to predict the spender class, then which I can also show as a chart like this. So you can think of it like a two-dimensional plot where we have days since installed and level reached. So that shows if someone recently installed the game, but then they reached much higher levels than others, then it means they are probably big spenders. Or if someone has been in the game for a long time, but they are still in the early game, then they are probably non-spenders. And the model basically gives you these boundaries by itself. And extra points to you if you realize that it looks like the IKEA doormat. Let's continue. Now we will use this decision tree to figure out the performance. Can we use level design practices to predict the level performance? In some games, you may have seen that there are multiple screens, right? Like you finish one checkpoint and then the screen transitions and up, or the screen transitions to the left, to the right, or lower. And then you can you may want to ask yourself, like, okay, like if I have one, or should I have more, like multiple checkpoints in my game or not? So when I feed this data to the decision tree, what it tells me is if a level has 1 or 2 checkpoints, then we will be most likely in quadrant 3, which means low sync, low churn. Well, that's not bad, but also not necessarily great for the lifetime value growth, right? But then the model says if we have checkpoints 3 or more, then actually here we have quadrant 3 more, right? And quadrant 2. And quadrant 2 is high sync, low churn, which is the best combination for the LTV growth. So here, if I'm not a level designer, if I have no prior knowledge, here the model is telling me what to do basically. So it says, okay, if you are making levels, maybe it's good to have multiple checkpoints in the game. Now let's zoom into the data. So initially we check the checkpoints, and now it says, okay, but wait, there's more. If you have 1 or 2 checkpoints, you can actually increase the lifetime value if you use jelly blocks. So it says if you use more than 0, so basically any positive amount of jelly blocks, then you will move towards quadrant 2. But if you use 0 jelly blocks, and if you have still 1 or 2 checkpoints, then you will be in quadrant 3. And remember, quadrant 3 here is low sync, low churn. Okay, so that's great. So let's go to the other side. If we have checkpoints like 3 or more, and in games we have fences, blockers. So it says if you have multiple screens but no fences, then results are even better. But if you have fences combined with multiple checkpoints, then we are in quadrant one mostly. And quadrant one, remember, it's high sync, high churn. So not ideal. Yes, it syncs high, but also churns a lot. And we can go even further. Then the model suggests that, well, if you have multiple fences and if you have multiple rockets, we are now zooming into quadrant one even more. And if we go back here, if we have spawners like some spawning system, it might be quadrant two, which is good. So maybe it's also good to discuss this with your favorite data analyst. I'm sure they can also explain. But here, without having any domain knowledge of level design, data analysts can also prepare some chart like this where they can tell you, okay, here is the model for what makes a level good. And here we can see that multiple checkpoints make a level good on average, right? Because they fall into quadrant two. And then, okay, it looks like fences may be, well, not necessarily bad, but they are bringing also churn. So if we don't have fences, but if we have multiple checkpoints, then it's actually good. And here, having jelly blocks is also good. Important question. At some point, you lose the statistical significance. Yes. You can zoom into anything. If you zoom in many times, then you will find totally randomness. So in decision tree models, you always have the p-value here. Like ideally, it's lower than 5%. Here, for example, you can see that it goes from 0 to 2.5%. So you wouldn't want this to exceed a lot. And not necessarily you need to wait for 5%. I would say don't dig very deep. Here I'm trying to show a very basic example. But basically, if you use 1 million tree splits like this, basically you will have one chart for each level, and it's not something you can learn from. So I would, when I work with this, I would always use 1 to 2 splits like this. So this is a depth of 3, I think, yeah. So, okay, yeah. Back to our questions, what makes a level good? We want to have a core content that generates high resourcing and low churn, and then it will boost the LTV. But then how does one even identify a good level? And we do that by comparing the resourcing. I will remove this question. We do that by comparing the resourcing and churn for the same or similar difficulties. And then we have a benchmark line, right? And whatever is above the benchmark line, that's a better level. And if under, that's a worse level. And how does one identify what makes a good level a good level? That's where we use the decision trees. So if we have the level mechanics data, then we can map that into the quadrants. So high sync, how can we achieve high sync low churn levels? Then let's check what are the contents of those levels and what kind of mechanics are there. Then we can use more of those, or we can create new level mechanics that resemble them, right? But then if there are poor combinations, and it's possible that there might be individually two or three different good mechanics, but maybe when combined, they are not well. So it's a really nonlinear problem here. Then yes, these are the philosophical questions we have faced. Now, about how should we design the level objectives? So level objective here is, for example, in really short and good question. If we just follow the model, wouldn't we end up designing a lot of very similar levels? So here I would say the first action point is to figure out the worst, like the biggest offenders, like the worst levels. If you have 10,000 levels and if you figured out actually 2,000 worst levels and or level mechanics, I think it's totally fine to get rid of them, and it's fine to make similar ones, or a lot of companies actually just copy paste existing ones. So that's to cut the bleeding initially. And I think that's a very quick gain. But then my suggestion when I was a product manager, like I was not for not necessarily just copying the good levels or having the similar ones, but if we understand what makes a level good, then we can understand the player psychology. And if we understand the player psychology, then we can make, okay, what kind of a level mechanic brings fun or additional value to the business. And then if we understand it, not necessarily we don't need to necessarily use the same exact thing, but we can make something similar or something that drives the same psychology. So here I would say, let's not be driven by data, but let's be informed by data. And then let's combine here the creativity of level design and the scientific part of this data. I hope that clarified, at least. That's how I approach. Okay, so level design objectives, level objectives. So in puzzle levels, we have, for example, here 4 jelly and 7 crabs, and this is from Dream Blast. We have 10 chick eggs and 10 cookies. So is there a way to also optimize those? Because sometimes in Royal Match you have 4 objectives and sometimes you have just one objective. So in my experience, some again prior info here. How the flow goes is you start a level, you either win or run out of moves. And if you run out of moves, you can purchase extra moves or not. And if you don't purchase, then you lose. And if you purchase extra moves, you either win or lose, and usually you win. And what we want to do is to maximize this purchasing extra moves without increasing churn. And if we want players to purchase extra moves, we need first them to run out of moves. But then it is also very important what kind of situation players are in when they run out of moves. So how it looks is assume that there is not really a high spender, but a player who spends some money in the game. They wouldn't want to spend mindlessly their coins. Here we are looking at now this line chart. On the x-axis we have the objective completion rate. On the y-axis we have the extra moves usage probability, like when they convert basically. And for those conservative spenders, it holds especially for them that they will convert mostly when they are closest to completion. Of course, there is some correlation and causality, duality here as well, but I think this is a good picture to visualize what's happening. So if someone completed only half of the objectives, unless they are big spenders, it's very rare that they will convert. But if they are at 95%, they know they are very close, so it's a good investment for them, so they will just convert here, or the probability is at the max here. And I want to show you what is a near miss. So this is from Best Wins, and you can see that players have 2 objectives and they completed the slugs, and now they need to collect only this rainbow bulb. And the player runs out of move now. Yes. And they are very close. Like if they get 5+ moves, they will definitely complete. So this is a near miss, so-called, or close call. And a far miss is where you have three objectives, and you are incomplete in all of them, right? None is complete. So that's not really the ideal moment when you run out of moves. The chances that someone will convert here is very low. And also, let's think about other games. There are, for example, in this example, you can see that we have different checkpoints, what we just talked about decision trees. Here, there's one slug, and you can see the HP of this slug. So now we beat this slug, and another one comes. And we still have two more slugs. But then, before even beating this slug, like there's one more, and I don't even know what the last slug's HP is. Or imagine that you have three screens or three checkpoints in a level, and you already failed on the first one. So I would not really convert at that point, because I don't know what is expecting me in the next one, or what am I even expecting? Like, is it a good investment? The uncertainty makes the investment here like very risky, so players won't convert. And I remember one rework we have done at Best Fiends was, in some levels we replaced those slugs, like multi-stage slugs. Instead, we had just one slug that have the one huge HP bar, and players could see the percentage completion. And then metrics changed drastically here, because then we eliminated the uncertainty with a very simple UI change. Players understood what kind of progression they were making, and when they ran out of moves, even though like overall completion rates were the same, now players were thinking more than before. So it's a very good way of telling the story of how to increase monetization without increasing the difficulty. Now it's all about the UI, UX here. Yes. Another very important thing about level objectives and CoinSync is, let's say we have a level where we have three objectives, and like imagine that you have, out of three objectives, there is one player who completed 2 out of 3, one player who completed 1 out of 3, and another player who completed none of the objectives. But they may still have overall same completion rate. Like let's look at this point. Maybe these players have 85%. Again, this is a toy example, so numbers are not, of course, accurate, but this is to tell the story, how it is. In all these three instances, players may have the overall completion rate the same, but on their UI, what they see is this player says, oh no, like I still have 3 objectives to complete. And the green one, they say, oh, I still have 2 objectives to complete. But then the blue one is more confident because they have only one objective to focus on with their 5 moves. That's why it's very important that when we design the objectives, they are not necessarily, especially in hard levels, they are not necessarily like these objectives are not the same difficulty. In my experience, ideally, there is one easy one middle one, and one difficult one. And by the end of the level, or when they run out of moves, they should have completed the easy and the middle difficulty ones, and they are left with only one objective. But if you are left with all 3 objectives because they are all equally difficult, then I would like, oh no, like if I purchase now 5+ moves, it will be difficult to concentrate on, like which one do I go for? And of course, players don't know what is their like overall objective completion rate is. Like this is something we can see from data. So it's important again. The difficulty may be the same, but it's important how players perceive the difficulty. And of course, like maybe this is expected, but something very interesting. Not all players have the same purchasing power, right? So, for example, the red line here, maybe these players, given the same completion rates, if they have a near miss, maybe only 5% of them will convert. But for someone who is maybe super rich and like they are in love with the game, their probability of purchasing extra moves will be much higher. And even more interestingly, if you look at like very far calls, like 60% completion rate, these players may still, the segment 3 players here, they may think still more than those who would have a very near miss. So this is driven by also like the purchasing power or how invested players are. And the highlights and action points here would be that I think it's very important that players should be challenged and they should definitely see out of most screens. They should fail the objectives in the first try maybe, but they should have a somewhat a close call when they do. And if in my experience, what I've witnessed is it's good to have multiple checkpoints, multiple slugs, or these kind of progressing objectives because it emphasizes the investment within the level and emphasize the progression. But then if we have those, then we are responsible with that players should be then very close to completion. Otherwise, these additional layers of progression, if players are very far from completion, then they will feel like, oh no, like I still have a lot of checkpoints to go through, and I don't even know where the end of it comes. So maybe it's not a good investment to convert here. Yes. And about the difficulty of the levels. So we know that there's a positive correlation between difficulty and resourcing. And of course, there's a positive correlation between difficulty and churn as well. Every now and then we want harder levels, right? Like we don't want only hard levels, but then it's very important that we don't let players also get stuck. Ideally, we want higher number of out of move screens, which will increase the extra moves usage. And we want less of those cases where players get stuck in a difficult level because then the churn will escalate. And the way I would like to visualize this is if in a level, let's say 100 coins were sunk, you can go ahead and check it from your data. I'm sure you will see something very similar. Actually, okay, there's one question I would like to show this. Okay, maybe I'll get to this after the presentation. I'll definitely get back to this. So most of the coin sync actually happens on the first attempt. So this is what we are seeing here. But not all of the churn happens on the first attempt. And that's important because and it makes sense because players sink their coins because they usually want to keep their win streak, right? And once they lose it, maybe it doesn't matter as much. But it's very rare that players will quit the game right away after the first failure. So they start churning as like over the attempts, maybe after 15 attempts or 20 attempts. But most of the coin sync happens on the first attempt. Then if you translate this into what is the gold sunk per churn player, so to understand what is the trade-off, like for each lost player, what is the coin sunk? And the value is the highest in the first attempt. So of course we can't have this for every levels, but this is to tell that most of the monetary value actually comes on the first attempt because players don't want to lose their win streak. But then there's also, so it's important to run them to out of move screen, so make the levels difficult enough. But then there's no use of getting players stuck in a level, because eventually the value we are getting is basically going to zero, and the total and the coins we will get is nothing compared to the elevating churn. So it is good to have kind of a churn prevention or dynamic difficulty system in the game that will allow players to pass or help after X number of attempts. And of course, again, about harder gameplay, yes, if you have harder gameplay, in the short term, you will have a better paying lifetime value curve. And again, the values are here totally arbitrary, but to tell the story visually. But because you are taking a huge hit on the retention, players churn more. In the long run, it may not be sustainable, and indeed, in fact, you may have a worse LTV in the long run. And the highlights here are and I'm seeing that Lauri is replying, and Lauri, thank you so much. And we worked with Lauri for many years, and we are very in line with this, so thank you. Okay, let's continue. It's important to have easy levels in between. I need to reply to this very quick. The curve winning after day 270 is not a sustainable run rate for most of the companies. Like I said, this is a very arbitrary number. So when we tested something similar, we could actually see that the harder variant was worse just in 1 month after 30 days. So it's just a chart that I had before, and it was easy to reuse, and numbers are arbitrary. Otherwise, you're right. But later, maybe I can share also how to detect if something will become, because already here you can see that, like by day 50 or something, it is possible to predict that you will end somewhere here. So you don't need to necessarily wait for 270 days. But maybe that can become another LinkedIn post. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so in the cadence for a difficulty, it's important to have easy levels in between, because then players will be building their win streak, and win streak is something that players value, right? They don't want to lose it. And something for the data scientist, it's also important to check the variance of the difficulty of the levels, and it should be somewhat small. And I'm not saying like zero, but somewhat small, because if you have two levels and on average they are the same difficulty, let's say players fail 3 times in both levels, but one has a much higher variance than the other one. So that means some players are randomly either winning on the first attempt with high variance, or they are stuck. And both are bad, because if they pass on the first attempt, that means, well, we are losing from monetization opportunity, or if they are stuck, then we are losing from the churn side. So it's important that also to set targets for difficulties and see if the variance is meaningfully small there. And the example we showed, let me show it again. So the example here, it's important to have a system that will allow players to pass or give them help if they are stuck in the game, because we are getting some coin sync if we make it super difficult, but then the churn becomes a bigger issue there. But however, those systems should not be predictable, and maybe they should be contextual. Like if the game maybe the game needs to know that players are genuinely trying to pass, but they are stuck. Otherwise, players may start exploiting these systems just to get help. And then the last part is how long should levels be? So this is an interesting data set that I collected 2 years ago. So here we have 6 games. So I collected those actually from YouTube. I was investigating. So there are a lot of walkthrough videos, right? And some fans are uploading these videos by playing the levels. What we are seeing here is these dots. They are representing the median duration for the same levels. So this might be level 100, this might be level 101. But for level 101, you might have 10 different YouTube videos. So I'm checking the median here. And then for each game, I'm checking the median of the medians here. So these lines are the median duration for levels. For example, Best Fiends is close to 5 minutes, whereas Dream Blast was around 90 seconds. And you can see that the Tap Blast games, they are snappier, whereas the Line Connect games, of course, this is a small sample, but there's a clear trend here. Like the swipe games indeed take a bit longer, whereas line games are the longest ones. But does it matter? Well, it turns out that it does. In an A/B test that we ran in the past was, what if we make the levels faster? And the difference between long and short levels in terms of duration, like second takes per attempt, is if the levels are long, then players have more investedness, like they feel more invested in the level, in the attempt, and they have more sunk cost feeling. But then that also means they can play less attempts per day. And if they can play less attempts per day, it means fewer out of moves screen impressions, so less monetization opportunities. And if the attempts are short, then there's lower sunk cost feeling, and that maybe drives less purchases per attempt, per level. But then that also means more levels played a day. And if players can play more levels, that means more out of moves impressions. And turns out that very interestingly, the daily play times are not affected by the level durations. So if you cut the amount of moves or make the animations faster and make the levels shorter, players end up playing more levels. And that's because the daily play time is still 1 hour in the long attempts and the short attempt levels. So by making levels shorter, you will end up making more out of moves impressions. And this, of course, needs to be A/B tested because maybe in your game it's already very short. So this is something that worked for us, and I'm sharing it. Maybe it works for you as well. And why was it important to me? Because in match 3 games, the monetization opportunities are usually bounded by, because most of the money comes from extra moves usage and maybe battle pass, but then these sync opportunities are bounded by level attempts, right? And but if you think about a game like Clash of Clans, I remember years ago, when I didn't work at even Supercell, I remember spending $100 just in one session in Clash of Clans to upgrade my village. But then in match games, you cannot do that. Like you need to basically fail a lot, but then we know that each level takes at least 1 minute, so these chances are not very often to sync or see out of moves. So I think it's a great, maybe low-hanging fruit if you can just increase the animation speeds or somehow cut the moves and make players engage more per day with the levels. And especially in PlayerX games, you may have seen that they have nowadays additional meta layers. Like they have a merge game, for example, in their match 3 games, which is an additional layer of potential engagement and monetization opportunity. Well, thank you. This was the presentation. I hope. Yes, but we have 30 minutes now. I would like to go through the questions and let's see if I can answer to those now. Okay. Mm. Okay, so the first question. Yeah. I'll just take this here. So the question is, how much time must pass before you to consider that the data is stable enough to measure level performance? That's a good question. So it's fairly quick to measure the coin sync and the difficulty, but if you want to check the monetary performance, I think coin sync is enough, and I would say that you can get that fairly quick. Maybe even 2 days could be enough because you are, of course, like these metrics are maybe a bit like front loaded. So over time, the average might change, but because we are looking at the relative performance of metrics, that should be fine. So I would say maybe just in 2 days, you can compare the difficulty and the sync of levels across levels. You can check their performance across levels, but then you need to wait 3 to 7 days even to get any data point for churn, right? So that will take a while. So churn is the issue here. And if you are in a hurry, like I remember, instead of waiting 7 days, then we just use, okay, let's check the 3-day churn rate, not 7 days, because we didn't want to wait. We didn't have time. And I want to emphasize Victor's question here. Again, yes, redesigning levels will move from one quadrant to another. So that's the aim here. You can also rework an existing level. You know that it doesn't work well, but you have an idea what makes it worse or better. Then you can shift it from one to other. And there was again the question: should we take into account sync of boosters, not only extra moves? Definitely. For that, the easiest way is maybe you should convert the booster usage into coin birth, and then you can combine it with extra moves coin usage. So you have apple to apple comparison, not apple to oranges, or you need to do it separately for boosters and for extra moves at that separate chart. And Yarden said that it depends on where the money comes from. Indeed, in the games I worked for, most of the money came from extra moves. So even only looking at the extra moves chart was enough for us. Here, yeah, there's a question about the churn rate of high levels. If you mean later in the game, like high levels, you don't need to, of course, wait for a new install to reach like you don't need to set a new cohort. What you can do is, okay, in the last 1 year, whoever stepped into level 1500, so that those are our active players. Whoever played, those are the active players. And what percentage of those players became inactive for at least 7 days since starting at level, and assuming they didn't complete the level yet. So that's why you don't need to wait very long. You can just take any arbitrary level, and then you don't need to set cohorts, like whoever steps into that level. Another good question. How about the noise? Churn depends on frequency of hard levels. I think one way to eliminate this is usually most games have a difficulty cadence. So, like, you might have a cadence of 5 levels: easy, bit difficult, medium, above medium, and then very hard levels. If it's like that, what you can do is, because it's also affected by the win streak, you can compare the easy levels to easy levels from other level brackets or cadences. But usually, most games I worked for, like, the cadence is somewhat predictable. Like it follows a similar pattern. So the noise that comes from hard level, like even if there's noise, you are still you are looking at the realized, like the actual difficulty, like the perceived difficulty, because we are measuring it from the data. So if the average fail rate is 3 in one level and also 3 in another level, then I can just compare these two and see if it made more sync. There's a question about loss aversion and fear of missing out, like the not per level, but more like a total experience. But I'm assuming that before even running, I think here what I'm showing is more level design meets data science kind of thing, whereas the total experience is more like a maybe product management kind of a thing. Like it's not indeed an experience. Like this super light bulb is not an experience where you can even manage just by level. I would think that it's probably A/B tested. Like maybe they are looking at a much longer range of levels. So what I'm showing here won't apply, and maybe it's missing out the fear of missing out here. Indeed. Yeah, I don't really think I can answer to this in context of what I showed here. So what I show here is more like level optimization, and these events or live ops events are usually balanced separately. Indeed, they are an experience of itself, and it's not one level, just many levels. Okay. There was one comment about the decision trees. So ideally, I wanted to simplify. I think having only 4 quadrants, like four combinations, is good to summarize like what we are dealing with, or what kind of how can we map the input to output, where we have only 4 outputs. So it's very simple. But what you could do is you don't really need to label those levels as quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4, so that you don't need to have categorical variables. You can actually just use the actual differences from the benchmark. So basically, what is the distance? Like if a level is much better, then check what is the delta, like how much of a delta we are seeing, and that can be the thing to predict, not the categories. And I see Laurie replied to some questions. Yes, Laurie actually replied a lot of questions, but I'll still go through. This session is actually recorded, and I will, of course, share the presentation, so you can check that. And I actually had to remove a lot of content from this presentation because the time wouldn't be enough. So I think there will be an upcoming follow-up. Still looking for unanswered ones. And I will definitely answer on LinkedIn as well. From Konstantin, there is a comment. I wonder if batching 50 levels will help in comparing spending and churn between them. So if I understand this correctly, we need to have a batch of levels, like let's say 50 or maximum of 100 levels anyway, because there will be a selection bias. Like if we cannot, for example, we cannot compare level 100 to level 5000, because of course the churn rate in level 5000 will be much lower than the 100. So it's a very simple bias. That's why we need to, what you mean here is what I understand, indeed we should maybe have 50 levels or 100 levels. So we should compare maybe level 100 to 120. Then they are closer to each other. Just a recent question. Are you considering giving different treatments depending on different player segments? Players have different levels then. I don't think this is something that's really done, giving different levels, but I mean layout wise. But difficulty, Definitely. So what we tried was not really based on if they pay or not, but what we did was definitely to uh, if players are more skilled, then they never fail. And because they never fail, we were afraid that they were gonna churn. So one metric you could use here is the out of moves rate. So regardless of if players pay or not, do they see the out of move screen? And if we have some players, let's say for level 100, our target out of moves rate is 50%, but then some player segments, we know that they will never see it. They will not see the out of move screen. So I think it totally makes sense to remove moves in advance, so they are challenged. Or if some players, if we know that no, the probability won't be 50% for them, it will be 100% because they are underskilled, then it's also important to increase their amount of moves and give them help. So I think giving different treatments based on skill, I think it's very common. Based on paying status, I think it may not be maybe very ethical. I don't know. I hope that answered. Mhm. Question from Mehmet. Um, Hybrid puzzles may be more aggressive on monetization and less sensitive to churn. So I think the issue I see here is less sensitive to churn. So that means if we don't see much churn, then it makes it very difficult to measure because churn is already in its nature not very easy to measure. Um, the reason is if you look at the churn rate on level 4000 of any game, you will have so few players there. And maybe out of 1 million active players on level 4000, maybe only 2 players will churn, but then the error margin is then super high. So it already makes it difficult to compare. And if in the hybrid puzzles you're talking about, or in any game where you see less churn, then it makes it difficult, first of all, to build the quadrant method because then, well, it's already statistically difficult to detect the differences. But then I think in any game, in any model, if you have two content like levels or content, whatever, you can always compare the sinks. Uh, if two levels have the same difficulty, then you can have a simplified version of the quadrants. So and not a matrix of 4 cells, but just two unrun oversinking levels. And yes, the definition of high sync and high churn will depend on the product. And it might be that you may need to remove the high churn or looking at the churn from the analysis. Maybe just focus on the sync. But of course, make sure that not now. So I'm now zooming out from level by level analysis, but I would of course look at the retention rates. If the optimizations you are doing based on the sync, maybe it's done very short-sighted, or like you are maybe like over tuning that. Maybe you are ignoring the in the long run the churn rates. So for that, I would just look at the retention rates, like day 1 or day 30 since players were exposed to a level or an A/B test or something like that. And good question. Um, yeah, if you improve the 50 of the worst performing levels, then it will increase the average, and you have a new benchmark. Yes, that's true. Yes. No. That's an amazing question. I really liked it. Thank you. That's the beauty of this model. So maybe those 50 worst performing levels, let's say in your game you identify those worst performing 50 levels, may turn out that these worst 50 levels are the best levels of another game. So what we are doing is always constantly improving the quality of the game. And that may mean that you may objectively have good levels, but relatively they are not good. And if you remove those 50 ones, indeed the overall benchmark will increase. So then what happens is, what we did was, you can basically rerun this optimization multiple times, and the benchmark line will just keep increasing. So that means by getting rid of the bad levels or making new levels that kind of resemble the good ones, you will always have a better and better benchmark. And let's say you run this A/B test for 10 times, and after the 10th, on the 11th run of this A/B test, the benchmark line doesn't improve anymore. Then I think that's the scenario where levels are somewhat aligned on the benchmark line, because we are kind of exploiting the unbalanced part of the game and make it better and better. So I think it's a very like a growth mindset kind of approach in games. Like there is no best or the good level. You are just trying to improve all the time. Yeah, Adam made a similar comment. Yeah, I agree. Always try to improve. Did you experience it making levels easier? I think we had it in all our games actually, making levels easier for a returned player. And not only, I think what we should do is not only to make it easier, but also if you look at Royal Match, Dream Blast, in all these successful games, players will get all sorts of free goodies, like a lot of pre-level boosters or unlimited lives, and that works very well to get players re-engaged in the game. So the first session when players come back after being inactive for long, that's very important. So definitely making levels easier and getting them kind of hooked again in the game, it's very important. Is there a way to, okay, one more question. Is there a way to map number of boosters, power blocks, objectives, number of swipes required? It must be possible. So I know companies making these like generative models that create levels, and if you feed those inputs as like, hey, these are what I want, these are my parameters, like blocks, objectives, or how many screens, slimes do you want in the level, and this is how many, what kind of difficulty I expect. It should be possible. Unfortunately, I can just confidently speculate that it's probably possible, but I don't know more. Okay. Can you talk a bit about player cohorts versus easy, medium, hard levels? Start to pay there. Yeah. Generating noise or false difficulty data. Yes, good question. So if we look at fail count data, so one way to check it is how many times do players fail before winning, and usually companies tend to look at the vanilla rate of difficulty. So so one way is, and I think it definitely makes sense, it's very important that you don't necessarily look at, if you want to look at the average, like overall average difficulty, you wouldn't want to include players' level attempts if they used extra moves, because indeed, like that's bringing noise to the data. So if you have a group of players who are just storming through levels, just not because they are skilled, but they are paying their way, then the difficulty seems to be just zero, like very easy. But in fact, no, they just paid for it. So removing those attempts is important. But then another issue is the difficulty we are observing then, the average difficulty, the vanilla difficulty rate, that doesn't take into account the payers' attempts. But then that's not the overall difficulty. Then that's the difficulty of non-payers, because we are removing those who would pay. So I think a good, for me, the best checkpoint is what is the out of moves rate, not what, because then it's not affected by what players do when they after they run out of moves, like if they purchased or not. So I would say looking at maybe out of moves rate is a better approach, because then it's more it's like a more fair way of looking at the difficulty when we have different pair structures. Okay, we have 4 minutes left, and I will still try to reply. Yeah, there were multiple questions about early levels. And there was a question about if we can use this quadrant approach for the early levels. Early levels is usually difficult to analyze because there are a lot of tutorials. So in tutorial levels, players usually just pass. They don't need to, they may churn, but they don't sync. So maybe one thing could be maybe the structure of tutorial, maybe some tutorial types are very like intrusive, so maybe those cause more churn. So you can still check the churn, but not necessarily the sync, because players won't sync, because players won't fail anyway. So yeah, I would check maybe what kind of tutorial levels those are, and maybe starting from level 10 or something, you can check also the sync. About analyzing the early levels, I think in the next presentation I can present something similar to this. So Ed, I hope you'll be there. Okay, and last question from Onur. When we disregard in-game events based on win streaks, it appears more logical to encounter more near-miss moments. However, what about far-missed moments while such in-game events are on? I think that's something we checked. And even if not, we know that players tend to think more on, okay, so what I can indirectly answer this question. We know that players tend to well, let's think about the Royal Match, I think it's called Super Light Ball event, or the Volcano event, where the fear of missing out is very high. We know that players tend to think more in those live events, live ops events. So their propensity of thinking is higher. And I'm sure if you are having a far miss, like a far call, while you are on one of those events, your probability of sinking will be higher compared to a time where you had the same completion rate, but you had the same completion rate, but then you would have definitely maybe less willingness to pay. But when you have the event on, I'm 90% sure that it will affect your motivation to purchase more. But I don't have a data for that. I don't remember checking it myself. But I know during events, players in general tend to think more. And if you have a farm miss, I'm sure the event motivation will compensate a bit for that. Okay, one last question. Normalizing the level churn rates. First days. Yes, in the first days, level churn, in general, churn is higher. That's why there are two important things. Comparing these metrics, especially the churn rate, compare those metrics in neighboring levels. So just take level 200 to 300 or 200 to 250. But if you want to compare 2000 level, then check 2000 to 2050. Because indeed, if you got to level 2000, then your probability of surviving even more in the game will be just longer. Like you are already very invested. So it's like a survival bias, selection bias. So my suggestion here is there is the natural retention curve, yes. Definitely, if you want to analyze a certain level group, then just pick 50 levels at once or something. Yeah, I think that's the short answer I can give. Okay, there are more questions. I will try to reply to them on LinkedIn later. I'm still on parental leave, but I still have some time, so I hope I'll manage. Well, thank you so much for being here today with me, and the recording should be there on LinkedIn, and I will also post the presentation. Thank you so much and have a great day. Bye.